New York, Saturday, the 6th of October, 1973. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel. In the early hours, American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger is woken in his suite with news of military activity in the Middle East. Two hours later, at 2 p.m. Middle Eastern time, Egypt and Syria launched a war against Israel on two fronts. After 3 years in power, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat had grown tired of peace initiatives that seemed to be going nowhere.
You know, fair mediators had not been successful in solving the problem. And the United States was the main supporter of Israel. So it was clear that if you wanted to solve the problem, you would have to do two things: either go to war or try to convince the Americans to move in the right direction.
2 weeks into the war, and with the opposing forces locked in a stalemate, Henry Kissinger arrived in Moscow. His goal was to agree a UN ceasefire acceptable to Egypt's Soviet allies.
The Russians had presented us with a resolution that was unacceptable, so we had to rewrite it, and Henry and I stayed up from midnight on to write it and get it all done, that we presented the next morning.
Within 2 days, the draft of UN Security Council Resolution 338 had been accepted by both the Soviets and the Americans. But instead of returning direct to Washington, Kissinger made a stopover in Tel Aviv for a few hours. That afternoon, 22nd of October, he would give his blessing to Israeli plans to violate the ceasefire, even before it had begun. On the 6th of October 1973, the Egyptians mounted a lightning attack across the Suez Canal. Their goal, to liberate the Sinai Peninsula, occupied by Israel 6 years earlier in the Six-Day War. 2 field armies, 100,000 men, had established bridgeheads 10 kilometers deep into Sinai. During the first week of war, the Israelis had lost equipment at an unprecedented rate: 500 tanks and 50 aircraft, to an Egyptian army equipped with the latest Soviet weaponry, handheld anti-tank rockets, and sophisticated surface-to-air missiles.
Right, it was a political situation. The Soviets were trying to impose their will in the Middle East to regain their positions. They had supplied massive amounts of arms to the Arab world. The United States had to respond, and it had to make sure that its weapons were not perceived as being inferior to the Soviet Union.
By the 14th of October, a massive American airlift had begun to carry weapons to Israel. The operation was codenamed Nickel Grass.
Electronic equipment was sent, which was helped to neutralize the SAM sites. TOW anti-tank missiles were sent. The strange thing is that the really important material that was sent was the most basic, the 105 millimeter ammunition. They sent that by the thousands of tons, and it was fired off almost immediately.
ובמהלך כל המלחמה אתה מקבל תחמושת שכולה, אתה רואה ארגזי תחמושת שהורדו ישירות מהמטוסים והאונייה, שאפילו אף אחד לא ניסה ליצור מראית עין שזה ישראלי, אלא על כולם היה כתוב US Army, אז ברור לך מה היה חלקה של ארצות הברית בסיוע לישראל לשמור על קיומה.
Reinforced with American arms, the Israelis now formed a bold plan to cross the canal at a gap they'd identified between the two Egyptian field armies. The plan was called Stout-Hearted Men. During the second week of the war, and after fierce fighting, the Israelis succeeded in crossing to the Egyptian mainland on the west bank of the canal. 3 armored divisions, some 600 tanks, formed an Israeli bridgehead in an area called De-escalating.
היינו צריכים להגיע לכל בסיסי הנ"מ, טילי הנ"מ, לתפוס את בסיסי הנ"מ ולפגוע בכוחות הנסוגים המצריים ולקטר חלקי הארמיות שנשארו בצד המזרחי של התעלה.
The Egyptians, confused and unsure what was going on, began to restrict the release of information about the Israeli presence on the western side of the canal.
وتصرحت القيادة المصرية أنه هناك 4 إلى 8 آليات إسرائيلية دخلت المنطقة ويجري التعامل معها. لحظتها قلت لصديقي بدأت القيادة المصرية تصدر بيانات كاذبة. إلى ما قبل هذه اللحظة كان كل بياناتها صادقة وكان الإسرائيليين يكذبون. الآن قلبت الآية، أصبح المصريين يكذبوا والإسرائيليين بياناتهم صحيحة.
On the other hand, the Israelis were working closely with Western journalists.
The main Egyptian force is just 5 miles further on, boxed in.
In purely military terms, it was a brilliantly conceived plan. The Israelis managed to...
Gerald Seymour with the Israeli forward troops in Egypt.
International correspondents accompanied Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan on visits to Israeli forces west of the canal. President Sadat claimed the Israeli operation in De-escalating was a mere television stunt, an attempt to cover up Israeli failures in the first week of war.
طبعا موضوع خطير مش سهل يعني. أنا ضد موضوع تلفزيوني ومش تلفزيوني. ثغرة كانت زي ما تكون طعنة في قلبي كقائد الجيش.
De-escalating, the area now coming under Israeli control, was rich agricultural land, totally different from the waste desert of Sinai. Egyptian special forces, working in small groups, used the lush undergrowth to set ambushes for the Israeli troops.
أنا واثق ليه؟ لأن حاسس إن أنا شغلتهم نفس الشغلة بتاعتهم. واثق في المظاهرات الصقع لأني عشت معاهم مدة طويلة. والمظلات طبعا كنت قائدها 3 سنين وعارفهم كويس وعارف إنهم مقاتلين جدعان يعني رجال تعتمد عليهم.
Egyptian Chief of Staff General Saad al-Shazli realized the war plan was on the verge of disaster. Anti-tank squads were desperately needed on the western bank of the canal to help stop the Israeli advance. But in ordering them to cross back from Sinai, Shazli was breaking presidential orders.
السادات كان يعني رأسه متحجرة على إن إحنا مادام خدنا رؤوس كباري في الشرق ما نسيبش الشرق أبدا مهما حصل. اسمنا إحنا شرق القناة، ولذلك قال مفيش بندقية تتنقل من شرق القناة إلى غرب القناة.
توقفهم إزاي؟ توقفهم إزاي؟ توقف عدو إزاي وأنت ما عندكش قوات؟ وقواتك 90% لا يقاتل شرق القناة بدون عمل. المهم في النهاية أصبح رئيس الجمهورية والقائد العام في إيه؟ في كفة، وسعد الشاذلي في كفة تانية. إيه الأوامر اللي هتتنفذ؟ قول أنت بقى.
Shazli, who had masterminded Egypt's initial success, was sidelined. From now on, Sadat and his war minister, General Ahmed Ismail, would take all the decisions.
لما عبرت القوات الإسرائيلية للغرب عملت خسائر كبيرة جدا في الوحدات الإدارية اللي هي بتبقى موجودة في الخلف، وهي وحدات غير مدربة. هو الهدف إيه؟ إحداث أكبر كمية رعب.
Now, the Egyptian High Command was running out of options. Air Force Commander Hosni Mubarak ordered his pilots into the air.
أنا فاكر مرة كنت داخل كده غرفة العمليات لقيت حسن مبارك بيبلغ حسن فهمي اللي هو حسن مبارك بيبلغ المقدم حسن فهمي، فحسن فهمي بيقول له يا فندم سيادتك شايف الجو شكله ايه؟ قال له طلع يا حسن. أهداف خطيرة جدا معادية، لكن لازم نطلع. طب انت هتطلع يعني ولا ايه؟ طب انت ما طلعتش ايه اللي هيحصل؟ هتخدم ده كله. واللي انت عملته ده هيروح اونطه يعني؟
Egyptian pilots also found themselves facing a new threat from the Israelis. From the ground, from occupied territory west of the canal.
عدوا بدفاع جوي متنقل اللي هو الهوك اللي على دبابة. احنا ما نعرفش ان هنا في صواريخ. الصواريخ دي وقعت مننا طيارات كتير جدا. يعني انا شخصيا وزميل ليا الله يرحمه جال لنا صواريخ هوك من الارض. حتى انا قلت لنفسي يا رب هي السويس بتضربني، كان فوق السويس بتضربني وانا ابنها.
After more than 2 weeks of war, it seemed all this bloodshed was about to come to an end. In New York, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 338, calling for a ceasefire.
Mr. President, we believe that the resolution now before us will, if faithfully implemented by all concerned, result in the prompt and effective establishment of a true ceasefire in the Middle East. Nothing could be more important as a step toward peace.
At 1852 Middle Eastern time, the fighting would stop. In desperate battles on the western side of the canal, Egypt had lost hundreds of men. 2 of its senior commanders, Brigadiers Ahmed Aboud al-Zumur and Ibrahim al-Rifa'i, had died in the fighting. But despite these losses, the Egyptians had stopped the Israelis from achieving the strategic goal of stout-hearted men. Today, just south of the city of Ismailiyah, Israeli tanks remain, at the point where their advance was stopped in its tracks.
لغاية دلوقتي إلى حد ما لم يتم قطع طريق السويس، ولم يتم حصار الجيش الثالث ولا الجيش الثاني. نجمة مين قال إن إسرائيل بتحترم قرارات مجلس الأمن؟
As the hour of the ceasefire approached, American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrived in Tel Aviv. The ceasefire he had just orchestrated with the Soviets had come too soon for Israel. They were desperate to fight on to consolidate their position. Kissinger agreed to turn a blind eye.
We can say that Israel had a greater interest in the ceasefire not kicking in right at that moment because it still had work to do, still territory it wants to capture.
As morning broke on the 23rd of October, Israeli forces went into action as though no ceasefire existed. 2 armored divisions, commanded by Generals Avraham Adan and Kalman Magan, raced southwards, bypassing Egyptian resistance points in a dash towards Suez.
ב-101 עשו את השיחות, אבל הקו היה להגיע 80 קילומטר מהבירה, עם 3 אוגדות. אני חושב שמפתיחה כזו כפי שהיא הייתה ועד לאיפה שהגענו, אבל בסופו של דבר, זאת אומרת, מאיפה שפתחנו ולאיפה שהגענו.
By nightfall on the 23rd, the Israelis had managed to cut the Cairo-Suez road and bypassed Suez City to reach the port of Adabiya. The Egyptian Third Army, dug in on the eastern side of the canal, now found itself under siege, surrounded by Israeli troops on every side.
مرحلة ذهول طبعا وخوف من تكرار 67. ما هو الخوف بقى من تكنولوجيا 67 اللي كان مسيطر علينا في الوقت ده، ان اللي حصل في 67 ممكن يحصل تاني، واحنا دلوقتي تحت رحمتهم.
In New York, at 11 p.m. Middle Eastern Time, on the 23rd of October, the reconvened Security Council issued Resolution 339. It called for a new ceasefire to go into effect at 7 a.m. the following day. But again, Israel was to break this second ceasefire.
كان هدفهم مدينة رئيسية، إسقاط مدينة رئيسية، إما الإسماعيلية أو السويس. يعني مدينة ليها اسم كبير. يعني هم كانوا بيحاربوا معركة إعلامية أكتر. في نفس الوقت كانوا عايزين يحققوا هدف سياسي كبير.
Until the Six-Day War, Suez was a flourishing industrial city and port. But after 1967, the city found itself on the front line between Egypt and Israeli-occupied Sinai. A target for Israeli attacks, it was soon reduced to rubble. A city of 250,000 people now lay virtually abandoned. Early on October the 24th, just as the new ceasefire was scheduled to start, Israeli tanks and paratroops moved into the semi-deserted city. But they soon encountered stiff resistance from a small city militia.
دخلت الدبابات دي، راح ابراهيم سليمان ضربها، راحت الدانه بتاعت ابراهيم سليمان داخله من مخزن الدبابه اللي هو السواق، قطعت رقبته وراحت موقفه الدبابه. اول دبابه تقف في السويس، كل الدبابات والمدرعات وكله وقفت ورا دي لان قفلت الشارع. وهم دارسين زي ما احنا دارسين وهم عارفين ان اي مدرعه او دبابه تقف في مدينه بتبقى قبر متحرك. راحوا نازلين من المدرعات وبدأوا يخشوا البيوت اللي في المنطقة.
The Israelis were driven from the city, losing 80 dead and 120 wounded. To this day, destroyed Israeli tanks remain, a testimony to the courageous resistance in Suez. Despite this setback, Israel's disregard of the ceasefire was buying it precious territory elsewhere, causing consternation in Moscow. The Soviet leadership was divided on its approach. While one camp favored maintaining a distance from the conflict, another believed the Israelis should be pressured into adopting a ceasefire. On the 24th of October at 9:35 p.m. Washington time, an alarming message arrived from Moscow. It said the Soviets were considering taking unilateral action to impose the ceasefire in the Middle East. The form of any unilateral Soviet action was, at that stage, unclear. Their options were direct military engagement, which was considered unlikely, or political pressure on the combatants. With President Nixon submerged in the mire of the Watergate scandal, it was left to Henry Kissinger to handle the crisis. Kissinger decided to respond to the Soviet threat with a show of force. At 11:41 p.m. Washington time, the American Armed Forces state of alert was raised to Defense Condition 3, the highest in peacetime.
Well, the question of the U.S. versus the Soviet Union always boils down to mutual annihilation. We could have killed everybody in the Soviet Union, they could have killed everybody in the United States, and the rest of the world would have gone. It was an absolutely insane situation. The thing that saved it was that each side knew that if a war occurred, the leaders themselves would get killed. And so when you know that you're going to get killed in a war, not just some poor peasant soldier is going to get killed, you make different decisions about starting a war.
Faced with the possibility of a spiral towards nuclear war, the next day, 25th of October, the Soviets stepped back. The alert was diffused.
We do not consider ourselves in a confrontation with the Soviet Union. We do not believe it is necessary at this moment to have a confrontation. In fact, we are prepared to work cooperatively towards the realization of the objective which we have set ourselves.
For a full 24 hours, the world had stood on the brink of war between the two great nuclear powers, but common sense had prevailed. On October the 25th, the UN Security Council issued Resolution 340, the third in less than 4 days, to finally impose a ceasefire in the Middle East. The following day, the vanguard of a new UN emergency force arrived at the Suez front. But despite their presence, skirmishes continued between Egyptian and Israeli troops on the western bank of the canal.
So this violation started almost immediately. And why? Because what had happened when the war stopped was that it stopped in the middle of ongoing military operations. So there were no natural lines of demarcation. The forces were nearly mixed on the battlefield.
With no clear borderlines between forces, a major breakthrough was needed to end the fighting and secure the fragile UN ceasefire. It would come when Egyptians and Israelis met in negotiations on the battlefield. For the first time in the 25-year history of the State of Israel. On the northern front, on the Golan Heights, the third week of the October War opened with Syrian and Israeli forces locked in a stalemate. Syria's initial thrust to recapture this territory occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War had been repulsed in a counterattack by hastily called up Israeli reservists. By the end of the first week of war, Syrian troops had been forced to withdraw while the Israelis pushed on across the 1967 ceasefire line towards the Syrian capital.
אני חושב שהעצירה 35 קילומטר מדמשק הייתה חכמה. זה המקום שבו נתנו תחושה שאנחנו קיימים בפנים, אנחנו נמצאים במובלעת. מלחמה חייבת להסתיים במקום שבו המדינאים יכולים להתחיל לדבר. ולכן המיקום שלנו היה נכון.
As the balance shifted in favor of Israel, other Arab countries sent troops in support. The Syrian front was strengthened by the arrival of expeditionary forces from Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. This cocktail of Arab forces would now be used in a counterattack to drive the Israelis back out of the pocket they had occupied in the Syrian mainland.
يوم 21/10/1973 علمنا أن هنالك خطة هجوم أو تعرض كبيرة سوف تقوم بها القوات العراقية والقوات السورية بأكملها استعادة المنطقة لحد حدود 15/10/1973. في تلك المرحلة كان هنالك أمل لاستعادة ما فقد من مسرح العمليات السوري.
The The attack was set for the 23rd of October, but it would never happen. On the 22nd, Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, unilaterally accepted a UN ceasefire that would take effect that evening. Syrian President Hafez al-Assad now faced the prospect of fighting alone on a single front. As the 23rd drew to a close, the Syrians too bowed to the inevitable. Assad would have no choice but to accept the ceasefire terms. But the Israelis were not done with fighting yet. A key listening post had been captured by Syrian paratroopers on the first day of war. With just a few hours left before the ceasefire, Israel's Golani brigade attacked. After facing fierce Syrian resistance, they finally secured their prize. But only after suffering heavy losses. 55 dead and 79 wounded.
יחד עם זה, אני חושב שלמדינת ישראל זה היה ציון דרך חשוב שביום האחרון של המלחמה הונף בחזרה דגל ישראל ודגל גולני על החרמון, ובעצם מנע מהסורים כל הישג שהוא.
On the Suez Canal front, things were no better for the Egyptians. The Israelis had the entire Egyptian Third Army besieged on the eastern side of the canal. 35,000 soldiers cut off from their supply lines.
بتاخد ما يكفيك تماما، بس على القد، مش ضروري تبقى ايه ممتلئ. ومعانا تعيين اسمه تعيين طوارئ، اللي هو ايه 3 بواكي بسكوت صغيرين قد كده بالظبط، ومعاهم قالبين عجوه. ده بيكفيك سعرات حراريه لمده يوم. ده اتاكل على 5 أيام لكل فرد. بعد كده.
But the Israelis were also facing a major problem. For the first time in the history of Arab-Israeli conflict, Egypt was holding a large number of prisoners of war, 230 in total.
أولاً هو وصول أول أسير إلى مصر كان في رفع معنويات كبيرة جداً للقوات كلها بالكامل، ورؤية في ذلك الوقت المخابرات الحربية رأت أنها لابد أن يتم التركيز على تصويرهم ووضع هذه الصور في وسائل إعلامية حتى كمان نرفع من الروح المعنوية لمستوى ليس فقط على مستوى القوات المسلحة ولكن للشعب ككل.
Back in Israel, demonstrators soon took to the streets, accusing Golda Meir's government of not doing enough to bring home the captured soldiers.
Golda Meir had some time before offered to have Israeli officers meet their Egyptian counterparts and to discuss what was most important to her, the release of Israeli prisoners, and also talk about letting supplies through to the Third Army. But she insisted on a meeting between the Egyptians and the Israelis, because until then the Egyptians were pretending, or like Israel didn't exist, they wanted no contact with it.
So it came as a surprise when the Egyptians accepted just such negotiations. The meeting point was to be a tent, erected at the sign marking 101 kilometers to Cairo, on the Cairo-Suez road. At 1:30 a.m. on the 28th of October, and for the first time ever, Egyptians and Israelis were about to have direct negotiations. But the negotiations quickly became strained as skirmishes continued in the confusion of the battlefield.
بدأت معارك تانية من نوع آخر. بعد وقف إطلاق النيران عملنا خطة اسمها ثأر وخطة اسمها شامل. يعني جات لنا تعليمات إن الدفاع يبقى نشط ما يبقاش دفاع سلبي، يعني ما تبقاش ساكت.
On the 30th of October, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir complicated matters still further when she made a morale-boosting visit to Israeli troops on the western side of the canal, on Egyptian soil. Meanwhile, the effects of this war began to be felt globally. Arab oil-producing countries had formulated a plan to use the price of oil to pressure Western supporters of Israel. By mid-October, several of the biggest producers had unilaterally raised prices by nearly 20%.
People were worried about it. It drove futures prices up, and people went bananas on wanting to fill up their cars. I think it satisfied a very real and important psychological need amongst the Arabs to have demonstrated that they could take some actions.
Now that this regional conflict was beginning to have international ramifications, on the 6th of November, American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew into Cairo for his first ever meeting with Anwar Sadat.
They started talking about Israel pulling back to the so-called October 22nd lines, where they should have stopped. Kissinger says, you know, we could argue for weeks and weeks and weeks over this, and at the end they would still be on your territory. It won't have solved a lot, but if that's what you want, we'll do it. And Sadat says, what's the alternative? He said, give me a little bit more time, and we'll go for a bigger agreement that will get them completely off the west bank of the canal, back into Sinai. And Sadat said, fine, let's do the big step, not the small one.
4 days after this meeting, an initial agreement was signed in the tent at kilometer 101. The first step in Kissinger's grand plan. The agreement guaranteed the Egyptians daily convoys of non-military supplies to the city of Suez and the besieged Third Army. For Israel, the key point of the agreement was an exchange of prisoners. Israeli prisoners arriving back in Tel Aviv were met by huge crowds. Prime Minister Golda Meir was moved to tears by the occasion.
ומיד שנפתחת הדלת לראות קצינים ישראלים נכנסים פנימה, ופתאום זה פעם ראשונה לא לראות קצינים מצריים, לא לראות שובים, לראות עוד פעם את מדי צה"ל. אנחנו לבושים במדים מצריים, אנחנו פדויי השבי. לא יודע, זה דברים שקשה לתאר במילים, ושאתה מגיע לגרם המדרגות, ואתה רואה את מחיאות הכפיים, ואתה שומע ורואה את הקולות. זה הרגשה פנטסטית.
As the new year arrived, Henry Kissinger returned to the region to hammer out the next step in his grand plan for Egyptian-Israeli disengagement. On the 11th of January, he met with Sadat in the southern Egyptian city of Aswan. Next day, in the afternoon, Kissinger left for Tel Aviv to meet up with the Israelis. After a week flying between Aswan, a city famous for its winter sun, and Tel Aviv, experiencing its first ever snowstorm, both sides accepted a disengagement agreement. A new term had entered the lexicon of international politics: shuttle diplomacy.
All I hope is that this effort will continue till we reach the peace based on justice in this day.
On the 18th of January, General Mohammed al-Ghamasi, Egyptian Chief of Staff, and General David Eliazer, his Israeli counterpart, signed the agreement in the tent at kilometer 101. It was the first in a chain of agreements that would lead to total Israeli withdrawal from Sinai in April 1982.
عظمة هذه الحرب حرب أكتوبر إن هي مش تأثير فقط على المستوى السياسي والعسكري والأمني، اللي أقصده هنا المواطن نفسه، إن بقى في قبول لفكرة إن أنا ممكن أسيب الأرض اللي احتلتها في 67 عشان أنعم بالأمن.
The agreement stated that Israeli forces west of the canal would withdraw to the East Bank and further east into Sinai. A reduced Egyptian force would stay on the eastern side of the canal in positions they had captured during the war. UN forces would police the buffer zone between the two armies.
An entertainment troupe came one day to sing for the soldiers on the western bank of the canal, and they included in the repertoire a song left over from the Six-Day War, making fun of the Egyptian soldiers, running away and leaving their boots in the sand. And when they finished singing, the soldiers came up and suggested that they take that song out of the repertoire. It is not appropriate anymore.
By the end of January, the Israelis had finished the first stage of their withdrawal from the western side of the canal. The road to the city of Suez was opened. After almost 100 days, the siege of the Third Army was lifted. Three weeks later, Egypt enjoyed a day of celebration. In the Egyptian parliament, Sadat held a ceremony to decorate and promote the heroes of the armed forces. But one name was missing from the roll of honor: General Saad al-Shazli, the man who had formulated the original plan for the war.
أنا لا يهمني أبداً، أنا أشوف أنا لا أبغي علواً في الحياة الدنيا، أنا أبغي الحياة الآخرة إن شاء الله، ولكن يهمني مصر. أخشى ما أخشاه إن الأخطاء التي وقعت في حرب أكتوبر، وهناك أخطاء رغم أن هناك أعمال مجيدة ما فيش شك يعني، إن أحفادنا وأولاد أحفادنا يقعوا في نفس الخطوة إذا لم يعرفوها. فأنا اللي يهمني مصر، ما يهمني سعد الشاذلي. أنا أجري عند الله إن شاء الله.
By the end of February, Israeli troops had completed the final stage of their withdrawal from the western side of the canal.
The mood as the Israelis pulled out, and this I experienced myself, and it was a bit like a carnival. Basically, they were relieved. Why? These were reserve soldiers. They'd been called up for months. They wanted to come home.
But even as Israel's soldiers celebrated, the mood back home was different.
Israel lost 2,600 men killed. Per capita, this is 3 times the death rate of the Americans in Vietnam over 10 years. This Israel suffered in 3 weeks.
The public wanted to know how come the Israeli civilian and military leadership were surprised by a mass Arab two-front attack. How come they were caught with their pants down? And they also wanted to know why the army performed so poorly in those first few days.
Less than 6 months after the start of the war, a commission of investigation headed by Shimon Agranat, president of the Israeli Supreme Court, would place the blame firmly on the military. 3 army heads would roll. Chief of Staff General David Eliezer, Commander of Southern Command General Shmuel Golan, and Head of Military Intelligence General Eli Zaira. The commission cleared Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. But the Israeli public were not appeased, and demonstrations broke out on the streets. 9 days after the commission published its report, the Prime Minister resigned.
And I openly accused, and still accuse, Golda Meir of killing more than 2,000 Israeli soldiers, and I don't know how many Egyptian soldiers, because of her sheer stupidity and obstinacy.
Yet it would be 2 months before Mrs. Meir would leave office. There was unfinished business with the Syrians. Since the ceasefire of the 23rd of October the previous year, the situation on the Golan front had remained inflammable. Skirmishes breaking out regularly. The Israelis still occupied a salient deep inside the Syrian mainland, not far from the capital Damascus.
עוברים שם לילות קשים וימים קשים, החורף יורד, נהיה קר, צף רוח לא גבוה, אחרי כמה שבועות אנחנו יורדים מהמובלעת, ועברנו חורף מאוד קשה וימים מאוד קשים, גם התנאים הפיזיים הקשים, של חיים בתנאי שטח, בחורף קשה מאוד, החורף שבין 73 ל-74 היה חורף קשה מאוד.
In May 1974, Kissinger set out on his second round of shuttle diplomacy. This time between Tel Aviv and Damascus. After almost a month of hard talking, he managed to secure a second breakthrough in the region. On the 28th of May 1974, the government of Israel approved a disengagement agreement with Syria.
I never thought you would kiss a woman. This is a day that we hope Syrian mothers, Israeli mothers, Syrian young wives, Israeli young wives, children on both sides of the border can go to sleep at night without terror, of dreams, of who knows. If their dear one is alive today, will he be alive again on the next day?
The agreement stated that Israeli forces would withdraw from the pocket they were occupying in Syria. Syrian troops would return to almost the same positions they had started the war from, with the UN-managed buffer zone between the two. Quneitra, the largest city in Golan, would be returned to Syria. On the 5th of June 1974, the agreement was signed in Geneva by senior military officers of both sides. The war in October was officially over on both fronts after 243 days of fighting.
Kissinger persuaded Assad to have a disengagement agreement on the Golan. In a sense, he tricked Syria into a disengagement agreement on the Golan, which was minimal. Syria recovered Quneitra, which the Israelis blew up before they left, and a tiny slither of territory, but everything else remained in Israeli hands.
The Egyptians got what they wanted out of it. So, Sadat had realistic goals about recovering the Sinai, and the war led to the recovery of the Sinai for Egypt. So you've got to see that as a win for the Egyptians. For the Syrians, they didn't recover the Golan, so you've got to see that as a defeat, essentially. For the Israelis, ultimately, they had reversed the course of the war, but they had suffered very heavy casualties. So you kind of have to see it as a bit of a defeat for the Israelis in terms of being caught by surprise.
ראשית, אני רוצה להגיד שאחרי שחוויתי מלחמה באמת כל כך קשה, שבה איבדתי והם כולם לא חזרו ביחד איתי, אז אני בהחלט חושב שאין במלחמה מנצחים. יש מי שמפסיד יותר, יש מי שמפסיד פחות, מנצחים במלחמות אין, וזה הדבר שאגב מלווה אותי מאז 1973 ועד היום. זה לא איזה עניין מקרי בהקשר הזה.
لما كنا بنرجع في القطر بتاع السويس ونوصل لكوبري الليمون، تبقى عارف ان احنا في العمليه الفلانيه والعمليه الفلانيه والعمليه الفلانيه، مات من عندنا فلان وفلان، وانت عارف مراته مين وامه مين، فاهم؟ عارفين بعض كويس قوي عائليا كلنا. استخبى تحت كراسي القطر، كلها كانت درجه ثالثه يعني، عشان هقول لهم ايه؟ فاهم يعني؟ ويبقى عينيهم فيها ترقب، باصين لك انت حظابط هو فلان فين؟ فاهم؟ تقول ايه؟ فالمعاناه دي كانت بترجك من جوه يعني، لان بتحس انك بتنفجر يعني. طبعا بنعيط، مش الصعقه حاجه والمعاني الانسانيه دي حاجه تانية، انما تقول لهم ايه؟ تقول له عيال وهي جايبه عيالين مثلا وجايين يستنوا ابوهم، ها؟